All right, I think we're ready to get started. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm so glad you could join us today for our economic and policy update, what to expect in 2026 and beyond. We're excited to have Alex Chausovsky with us today. Alex is the Director of Analytics and Consulting at the Bundy Group, and he's spent more than 20 years helping business leaders understand the economy and make smart strategic decisions. He's known for turning complex data into clear, practical insights and always brings great energy and perspective. Please join me in welcoming Alex.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for having me back. I appreciate it. Thanks to all of you that are here today, taking time out of your, which I'm sure, very busy schedules to inform and educate yourself and to take a little bit of time to think about kind of how to work on the business instead of in the business. I think it's always very healthy to do that at least a couple of times a year. We've obviously got a lot going on in the world around us. Things have changed quite substantially since my keynote back in April. And so I'm really delighted to be able to present you with this update and to help you, understand what are the tactical and the practical things that you should be thinking about and positioning your businesses for as we prepare for the rest of this year and into 2026 and beyond, of course. So as you can see here, the title of the presentation today is Economic and Policy Update, What to Expect in Late 2025 and Beyond. And I joke that sometimes I feel like I could also call this presentation, This is Fine, right? Like the world might be on fire around us, but we all know, and we have calluses from adapting to previously unexpected things, COVID being the most recent example of that, of course, that no matter what happens, we'll be able to figure it out. We'll be able to persevere. And I think that that's a big part of the message that I want to deliver for you today is that really, you don't have to have complete clarity in terms of knowing what will happen in the future, but your people do look to you as leaders, as decision makers, for the confidence that no matter what happens in the future, you'll be able to figure it out together. And that's, I think, an important element to bring to your conversations internally and with outside customers as well. Things are going to be okay, despite the fact that we are living in very, very tumultuous times. So to give you a clear lay of the land, if you will, of what's happening right now and what to expect in the future, I'm going to break the presentation down into a few different sections. The first one is to provide you with a global perspective. Obviously, geopolitics and the interactions between nations take up much of our news feeds these days. And so I want to make some commentary around what I think is happening and perhaps try to understand some of the rationale that the current administration is following in terms of some of the decisions and some of the outcomes that they're hoping to achieve. So I'm not asking you to agree or disagree with President Trump and his cabinet. I do think that as business leaders and as people responsible for making decisions, it does help us to think about what might be motivating to the administration to behave in the way that it is, and what are some of the causal factors that are driving their decision making and their actions right now. We'll then take a look at the impacts of policy so far this year, specifically looking at kind of the tariff landscape and the more positive effects of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. We're going to look at the latest economic data, and then, as always, I'll try to provide you with actionable takeaways throughout the presentation. And certainly at the end, we'll wrap this up nicely into a few key strategic and tactical things that you should be planning on as you prepare for 2026. So with a lot to cover, I won't delay anymore. We're going to get right into it. And let's just take a look at the global economy as it stands so far in 2025. Well, you can see here a few things. Number one, on the left, you're seeing the actual snapshot of the global GDP for 2025. You can see this year, the overall economy is worth about $115 trillion, of which by far the largest single chunk is the United States. And you can see that here, the US in 2025 is a $30.3 trillion economy. And despite the narratives that exist out there about, we're being overtaken by China, we're ceding ground, or we're somehow losing in our contest with China, the numbers just don't back up that narrative whatsoever. You can see here China this year, despite several decades of double-digit growth, is still just $19.5 trillion, or roughly speaking, a third smaller than the United States economy. And so we're at no risk in being overtaken by the Chinese, as some people would have you believe. I do think that it's important to understand that, we are still growing faster than us. And even with that growth exceeding that of the US, this year, for example, the expectation is the US is probably going to see growth somewhere in the 2.5% range. China is probably going to see growth somewhere in the 4.5 to 5% range. So their growth is still double that of us, if you believe, of course, the official Chinese numbers. But even if you don't, I think it's fair to say that they are managing to grow their economy at a faster clip. But with the growth rates having settled down into low single digits for China, they're not positioned to overtake the US anytime in the foreseeable future. And so that's not something that we need to be worried about. But it is something that the administration, I think, is thinking about, especially as China competes more and more effectively in certain key areas of the economy, specifically advanced technologies like semiconductors and AI, as they continue to, misbehave and dump certain product categories on the US market. Here I'm talking about things like electric vehicles. I'm talking about steel, solar panels, and even some of the basic foodstuffs as well, or some consumable products that we all use in our day-to-day lives. And so, in recognizing this, I believe that one of the things that the administration is trying to do is trying to stifle, or at least throw a little bit of a roadblock for China, so that that growth doesn't continue to accelerate, and they don't have the opportunity to take the US position at the top of the economic pyramid. So I think that that's one of the elements that President Trump and his cabinet are trying to do, is basically kind of put some drag on the Chinese economy, slow them down a little bit, so that we maintain our economic superiority and are not challenged for that pole position the way that we've been able to enjoy that for quite some time. The other element that you have to understand here is that while there are lots of news reports about countries like Iran or North Korea or even Russia, that dominate the news cycle, from an economic perspective, countries like that don't really matter all that much. You can see here, Iran is just 464 billion, so very, very small. Here is Russia, 2.2 trillion. I mean, most people don't realize this, but the Russian economy is about the same size of the economy of New York City. That, just to kind of give you some sense of comparison. And so, those are not the movers and shakers on the global economic stage. Really, there's three key entities that we tend to focus on when I look at the world of macroeconomics, and that's US, China, and then the European Union, which all collectively, the 27 member states of the EU, represent, roughly speaking, another, call it 25 to 27 trillion dollars of economic activity, which means that US, China, and the EU combine to make 2/3 of the global economy. You add countries like India and Japan into the mix, and now we're talking about 75% of the global economy. So it's really interesting to understand kind of where we fit in to the big picture, in order to try to kind of comprehend the rationale that the administration is trying to pursue. The other element that I want to introduce for you here is the right side of the slide, which talks about kind of the emerging spheres of global power, and the fact that we're living in what is called a multipolar world today. So what I mean by when I say multipolar is that there are multiple competing centers of power that are constantly vying in contest with one another. So if you think about the 1900s, for example, it was a bipolar world. We had the US competing against the USSR, both economically and militarily. As we moved into the late 1900s, meaning like 1990 and beyond, and the Soviet Union collapsed, we had a unipolar world for a period of time, where the US was unchallenged in any way, shape, or form, not economically, not militarily. But really, over the last 5 to 10 years, we've kind of changed the dynamic, specifically since 2001, when China was invited to join the World Trade Organization and really started to see its rise to power. And now we have a world that's split among these axes of power. So in one corner of the boxing ring, if I may use that analogy, we've got the US and our financial and military allies, and that's countries like Japan, Australia, the European Union. In the opposite corner, we've got China and its financial and military allies. And that, of course, is countries like Russia and Iran. Then there are what I call free agents, countries that sometimes they're referred to as members of the global south, but it's countries like India, Turkey, and Brazil. These countries really make up basically, they don't align with either the US led alliance or the China led alliance. They pick and choose depending on the issue involved. And sometimes they throw their lot in with us. Sometimes they go along with China. It just depends on what they're trying to achieve in any given situation. And then most recently, probably in the last 5 years or so, so since COVID, we have the emergence of the tech uh, superstars, the Magnificent Seven, if you will, as another center of power. So if you look at the logos that I've included here in the bottom right hand corner, companies like Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, Nvidia, Apple. Not only are these companies generating revenues at a country level scale, meaning that their annual revenues exceed the GDPs of most countries around the world, they are also consuming electricity and water at a country level in order to run all of their data centers to kind of support the AI infrastructure and all of the technology consumption that they're doing. So, not only are the companies themselves acting almost like countries, but their leaders, people like Elon Musk or Sundar Pichai from Google or Satya Nadella from Microsoft, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, Mark Zuckerberg from Meta. These guys are increasingly active in the world of politics. They're donating to campaigns. They're actually, in the case of Elon Musk, they're going door to door for candidates, and they're actually taking active role in negotiating. So obviously, earlier this year, we saw Elon Musk take a very active role as part of the Doge initiative. At some point in the spring, Elon Musk was negotiating with the foreign minister of Iran at the United Nations to try to bring Iran back from the brink and try to curtail their nuclear program. More recently, in fact, I think it's happening today or tomorrow, that the leader of NVIDIA, Jason Heng, he is actually traveling with President Trump to go and speak to the governments of Japan and North Korea in terms of investment and chip cooperation and all sorts of technology transfers. So we can see that these guys are increasingly active in a geopolitical capacity. And the realization that this is happening basically leads us to one very clear conclusion, that at the beginning of the year, we were thinking that there's so much uncertainty, there's so many unknowns. Well, a lot of that stuff has now kind of fallen into place. Yes, it's still volatile, especially on the tariff side, but we now know what the taxes environment is like, and we know that the volatility with tariffs will continue. So I think we're transitioning from an environment of uncertainty to one of complexity. And it's this realization that we're living in such a complex world that you, as leaders and decision makers, will have to plan for a variety of different scenarios in order to not be caught unawares, whether it's supply chain risk or managing your inputs, whether it's how do you go to market strategy, all of these things, you've got to be prepared for scenario A, and you know what you'll do in that case, scenario B, and you have a different set of planned activities for that situation, and scenario C, D, E, and F as well. But that's a very different mindset than historically companies have been expected to develop, which is, you make a plan, you execute the plan, and you recognize, a good performance. Now you've got to be prepared for a great deal of variance in the scenario landscape. And one term that I think is particularly appropriate, both in terms of this conversation and in terms of the scenario planning, is called VUCA, VUCA. It comes from West Point Military Academy. Whenever West Point cadets and some of the leading members of our military go to do wargaming, they use this term to describe a scenario of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That's what VUCA stands for. That's the world that we're living in, and that is going to mark not only 2026, but certainly many years beyond that, as we pull back from globalizations and as countries increasingly focus on achieving their own individual prerogatives. So this should give you some sense of kind of the lay of the land geopolitically and macroeconomically. Although I will say that, looking at the economic picture on the left here, that's not the only way to consider the economic performance. We also have to look at it from the perspective of purchasing power parity, or PPP. Why? Because purchasing power parity is the only factor that recognizes that the affordability issue is very different from country to country to country. So on the left here, you can see that if you look at the global economy from a purchasing power parity perspective, it's not the US that's the largest. It's actually China that is quite larger. And disproportionately bigger is also Russia over here. So what that basically means is that I guess the best way to talk about this is by referencing something called the Big Mac Index. Some of you might be familiar with this, some of you might not be. Basically, this is a economic series that tracks the cost of a Big Mac sandwich from McDonald's across all the different countries of the world. And you can very quickly start to see that a Big Mac costs a lot more in the US and Europe and in other developed countries like Australia and Japan than it does in places like China and Russia and other developing countries. And nowhere is this concept of purchasing power parity more important than in the military space. So on the right-hand side here, you can see this is the military spending by country that was in place for 2024. So the US, as an example, spent almost $1 trillion on our military and defense space. If you look at this in pure dollar terms, we actually exceed the top 9 countries after us combined in terms of how much we spend. But when you factor in the impact of purchasing power parity, you very quickly realize that for the $314 billion that China spent last year, they can afford to acquire a lot more missiles and planes and ships and tanks and pay a lot more soldiers than we can for a similar amount of money. And so their actual PPP military spending is somewhere closer to $800 to $900 billion worth, which is why we've seen them close the gap so substantially in recent years with the US in terms of military power projection, at least in the Indo-Pacific region. We're not quite seeing them be able to project power globally the way that the US can with our Navy and our fleet of aircraft carriers, but they're certainly playing catch up in their local sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific. Same thing can be said for Russia, which in terms of actual dollars only spent 150 billion, but in terms of PPP dollars was closer to $500 billion worth of military spending. So I think another element that I'm observing from the administration is a intentional kind of desire and objective to slow down this closing of the white space between the US military power and that of our main adversaries, of course, being China and Russia. So I think that a lot of the policies that the administration is pursuing are geared towards keeping number one, the US at the top of the economic pyramid, globally speaking, for a long time to come. And number two, keeping us as the primary military power in the world and slowing down some of the development and some of the catching up that our chief adversaries, namely Russia and China, have been doing in recent years. And one of the ways that we have gone about doing that is through the policy, of course, of trade protectionism and specifically of tariffs. And so here I wanted to just highlight for you how different it is this time around compared to what President Trump was doing with tariffs during his first term in office back in 2017 through 2020. So back then, President Trump focused specifically on unique product categories, and he pursued that basically through 2 types of tariffs, Section 301 and Section 232, and he always tried to get the backing of Congress, or at least of the Republican Party, behind him. He wasn't acting unilaterally. Not the case this time around. You can see the how across the board is almost exclusively through executive order. Basically, he is making the decisions and he's acting on those decisions without getting the backing of Congress and without even getting the support of his own GOP behind him. The negotiating points have also evolved quite substantially. You can see we're still talking about trade deficits, but you'll notice specifically in the last 6 months or so, that conversation has faded. And more, depending on who we're negotiating with, we're talking about other points of contention. For example, for China, we're talking about issues of national security, intellectual property protection, critical minerals, access to specific materials that we need for many of our industries. In the case of Canada and Mexico, we're talking about things like immigration and drug trade cooperation. And yes, even more importantly, this issue of Chinese transshipments, which is where the Chinese were trying to skirt US tariffs by shipping products first to Mexico and Canada and then trucking them in to the US across the borders. And in the case of our more traditional trading partners like the European Union, we're talking about issues like NATO defense spending. When we talk to Brazil, we set a 25% reciprocal tariff for Brazil. Then President Trump didn't like the way that the Brazilian government was prosecuting the ex-president, which they viewed as trying to stage a coup, something similar along the lines of what we had happen here on January 6th. But in the case of Brazil, the ex-president is actually in prison for that right now. And President Trump saw a lot of parallels between the perceived witch hunt that he felt himself go through and what was going on in Brazil, and unilaterally overnight doubled that reciprocal tariff from 25 to 50% because he said they were not behaving nicely towards their ex-president. In the case of India, President Trump also doubled their tariff from 25 to 50%, but in this time, it's more from a geopolitical perspective. He's trying to dissuade them from buying a lot of Russian oil on the black market. And so you can see these are negotiating points that don't have anything specifically to do with trade. Although the trade deficit is still mentioned once in a while, there are many other talking points of contention that are being discussed in some of these trade agreements that we're making. I think that in some cases, I can get behind the policy. For example, making sure that China behaves fairly when it comes to both national security and critical minerals. In other cases, I don't understand and really can't get behind the policy. For example, charging Canada an extra 10% tariff overnight just because they ran an ad with President Reagan's message from several decades ago. That to me doesn't make as much sense. It doesn't make much sense to me to double reciprocal tariffs overnight on Brazil because of political motivating factors. So, excuse me. I think it's fair to be able to say, I question some of the things the administration is doing, and I can get behind some of the things that they're doing, but maybe others I don't agree with or don't support. I don't think it's a black and white issue in this case. And as business leaders, we have to be objective and fair in our assessment. And that's where my positions tend to come from is, do we actually stand a chance of achieving the type of objectives that we want to achieve as a country? And what are the potential risk factors involved in pursuing these kind of policies? And you can see the risk factors there on the bottom are quite significant. In the case of China, as an example, they can cut off our access to rare earths. They can exert a lot of influence on bad actors like Russia, Iran, or North Korea. In the case of the other trading partners, we have to recognize two things. Number one, we have totally new governments in place in many of these countries. And a lot of times those governments are more conservative, more nationalist, more inward focused. And so these are not the same people that President Trump was negotiating with back during his first term in office. In most cases, when we talk about our allies, whether that's Canada or Brazil or India, what we don't want is to push our historic military and economic allies into the very open and waiting arms of China and Russia, which is something that we have seen some traction in happening, especially when Prime Minister Modi from India was at a summit in Beijing a few weeks ago, and he was seeming very friendly with both President Putin of Russia and President Xi of China. That's really not something that we want to see kind of build momentum over the next few years. We want to retain our alliances and strengthen those partnerships rather than push our allies into the open arms of our adversary. So this strategy, while I understand some of the motivating factors behind it, is also not without significant risk because some of the consequences that might happen might be unintentional. So when we look at the overall tariff landscape right now, it's quite complex. And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, other than to say that we currently have three categories of tariffs in place. We still have the Section 301 and Section 232 national security tariffs. Those are predominantly targeting specific product categories with goods coming from China and things like steel, aluminum, automobiles, and auto parts from all sorts of trading partners that we have. And then we have this category called IEPA. That's IEEPA. It stands for International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And that is something that President Trump is basically saying, I can act unilaterally because these things are all economic emergencies. Well, a few weeks ago, an appellate court said it is unconstitutional for President Trump to be acting in this unilateral kind of this executive order manner. And now this case has gone all the way to the Supreme Court. And on November 5th, there will be a hearing, which President Trump said that he's going to be attending personally, that will decide whether or not he can, in fact, implement these IEPA tariffs to the extent that he has. If there is a reversal of that, that's going to be quite a Pandora's box opening up, because then the question becomes, well, what do we do with the tariff money that we've already collected? Do we give that back? Who do we give it back to? Are the companies that are going to receive that money back going to pass those funds back to some of the people that they're charging higher prices on? So it's a very complex situation, as you can see, and it really kind of supports or underscores that point that I made earlier, which is we're living in a very, very complex time, and that's why most organizations are taking the time to plan for a variety of different outcomes. Now, the good news on the tariff front is that there's not been nearly the detrimental effect that everybody feared at the beginning of the year in terms of the impact from the tariffs to the economy. And that has to do with the difference in the effective versus the actual tariff rate. So when we look at the effective tariff rate, which is what I'm showing you here, it shows you that at the beginning of the year, before President Trump implemented any of his tariffs, we were at an effective tariff rate of about 2%. And through basically the last 10 months or so, through a variety of different developments, including Liberation Day back in April, we saw a peak effective rate of upwards of 30%. That has since been scaled back, and we're currently on something like 18% effective tariff rate. But the good news here is that the actual tariff rate, the one that US companies are actually paying at the border when they take ownership of incoming product from overseas, has been closer to about 9%. And the reason for that is because we have not just basically passed all of those tariffs along, and we have not seen the surge in inflation that most people were expecting. We've actually adapted a multi-pronged, kind of multifaceted strategy in terms of dealing with these from a company perspective. So you can see this pie chart, this is from Goldman Sachs, very recent data, shows that approximately 9% of the tariffs are actually offset by foreign exporters lowering their sales price in order to maintain market share in the US market. About 51% of the tariffs are actually being absorbed currently by US businesses, and about 37% are actually being passed on to the US consumers in the form of higher prices. So still a fairly small, limited impact of the pass-through cost function, and that's why we have not seen inflation rise any more than it actually has so far. Now, speaking of inflation, what we have is an environment that is likely looking to see further slow but gradual increase in inflationary pressure as we traverse this last quarter of 2025 and then go into 2026. So this is the most commonly used measure of inflation. It's the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. You can see two lines on this chart. The light blue line is the overall CPI, and the dark blue line is it's called core CPI, or the basically they've extracted the very volatile food and energy prices and then plot the rest of the categories. And as you can see, as of the latest data, which we got just last week, we have a CPI of both at the overall level and at the core level of about 3%. So it's a far cry from the peak inflation rate of almost 9% that we had back in 2022. But we are also moving further away from the Fed's 2% target. We're not getting closer to 2% inflation. We're slowly but surely getting farther away from it. And I expect that by the end of the year, we're going to be somewhere in this 3 to 5% range, probably closer to 3.5% if I had to take a guess at this point. But we still have to leave plenty of open room for upside pressure from tariffs because as President Trump is trying to cope with this legal challenge to his IEEPA tariff, him and Secretary Treasury Bissett have made very clear that they have a plan B, and that plan B involves a lot more Section 232 or product category specific tariffs. There are currently about 12 different investigations going on, with more tariffs to come as those investigations wrap up on everything from pharmaceutical products to semiconductors to process critical materials to machinery and robotics, and all sorts of different product categories are still to be hit with future tariffs. So my expectation is that the inflationary pressure will remain elevated without getting nearly as out of hand as it was back in 2022 to early 2023. So tariffs may be a major headwind to the economy, but they're not also acting in a very detrimental way right now. I would say that if anything, they're causing the economy to be stifled, to basically tread water currently as the uncertainty remains pervasive and businesses kind of continue in this wait and see approach. However, there are also some positive developments on the policy side that need to be acknowledged because they are helping to offset some of the negativity driven by tariffs. And one of the best examples of that is the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act back in July. Now, what I will say on this is I am not a tax expert personally, and this is one of the most complicated pieces of tax legislation ever to be produced by Congress. There are over 80 instances in this bill where it says that the Commerce Secretary shall ... which means that some of the laws aren't even finalized yet. But what I can also tell you is that the low-hanging fruit of this act is clearly the addition of the domestic R&D expenditures. Those are now tax deductible retroactively going back the last 3 years. And the reinstatement of the 100% accelerated depreciation provision, which means that any major CapEx initiative that you're doing as a business is now 100% tax deductible in year one. That includes plant and equipment. It includes, really any major investments that you're looking to make. And so make sure that you're consulting with a tax professional. As you can see, there's a whole lot of other elements that I don't feel super qualified to talk to you about, but you do need to understand how all of these things affect your business so that you know which ones you're able to actually take advantage of to offset some of the higher costs related to the tariff environment and continue to try to preserve your margins in this environment of gradually slow burn increasing inflation. So I hope you're able to take advantage of this to some capacity, but I definitely recommend that you talk to someone who's a tax pro. I know a company called Wipfli that they're really good at knowing how to apply this law to individual small businesses. So I don't have anything to do with them, but certainly feel free to reach out to that organization for help. Okay. So the first half of the presentation was the policy and the global environment. Now let's look at the data. Let's see what the economy is actually doing, and let's try to figure out, where we're headed as we traverse this last part of 2025 and prepare for 2026. This first chart, I'm showing you the big picture macroeconomic view. This is US real GDP. And by real, I mean it's already adjusted for the impact of higher prices. So we've stripped out the effect of inflation. And lo and behold, through the second quarter, basically through mid 2025, which is the latest data we have available right now, the US economy is at a record high. It's never been as robust or as large as it's been as it is right now, which is remarkable given all of the uncertainty, volatility, and headwinds that we've been facing from the policy environment. So this is what I call the face value of the economy. This is, think of this as a person. If the economy was a person, this would be the external appearance. However, it's important to also look below the surface for a person, you really don't know their health unless you understand what their blood pressure is, what their vital signs are, like a heart rate and cholesterol level. So looking at the same exact data here, but plotting it as a growth rate over time, what you're seeing is the business cycle of the US economy. This is quarter over quarter growth in our real GDP. And you'll see it actually looks a little bit like a heart rate monitor for the economy. Anytime this blue line dips below the dotted line along the zero axis, that is recession. So here is 2008, 2009. Here is the much more painful but much shorter lived recession of 2020. Here's that rebound period that's unprecedented. We have seen nothing like that happen ever before in our nation's history. And where we are with the latest data all the way through mid 2025 is we're growing at 2.1% quarter over quarter. So that's actually very much in line with the historic average. So those people in your lives, whether it's friends or coworkers or family members that say we're in recession right now or we're imminently heading for a recession, challenge them on that front. The data does not support that we're either in recession or are imminently heading for one. The data says that we are actually growing, roughly speaking, at the average growth rate that we've seen over the last 20 years, which is fairly positive in my view, given, as I said, all the disruption that exists out there. However, I also want to point out that the economy does not move all in sync. There are different elements to it. And so what we're also starting to see that while the economy is growing, it's doing so in a much more K-shaped manner. And when I say K-shaped, I mean that there are some segments of the economy that are outperforming and some that are underperforming. And so here we're looking at consumption activity. By the way, consumption accounts for about 2/3 of overall GDP. That's the amount of money and economic activity that we spend just living our day-to-day lives, US citizens and permanent residents and anyone else in this country. It's basically all economic activity related to personal consumption. And as you can see here, it is the top 20% of income earners that have really held the economic profile up over the last year to year and a half. The middle class and the bottom 40% are trending much more just in line with the inflation trend, which is the red line here. And so they're not the ones responsible for the current positive traction in the economy. It's really the top 20% of income earners. So I think it's an important distinction. I'm not saying that everyone out there is doing honky-dory. It's not everyone is great. But I am saying that because of the outperformance of the top 20%, the overall economic landscape looks actually pretty healthy and resilient. Now, shifting gears to another part of the economy, and one that I think probably is more reflective of your industry, that's the business to business economy. That's US Industrial Production Index. This is, rather than being measured in dollars, this is an index, so it actually measures the volume of industrial or B2B activity in the United States. And what you can see very quickly here is that it is unlike GDP. It is not at a record high. In fact, if we look at the last 2 years, we've had very minimal growth achieved in the US industrial economy. You can see it's only up 0.4% over the last 2 full years, going back to the fall of 2023. Again, looking at the same data, but the vital signs or the business cycle of the industrial economy shows you that while we are positive, you can see 2 lines here. Light blue is quarter over quarter. The dark blue line is year over year growth. So we are in positive territory at just under 1% on an annual trend. You can also see some really interesting developments that have happened over the course of the year. So first, you'll notice that the 2 lines are basically skirting along zero from mid 2023 through mid 2025. Mid 2024. And in late 2024, right around the time of the election, this light blue line started to show some real momentum. I think that the business community in particular was very optimistic about President Trump winning the presidency. They expected less regulation, a more pro-business friendly environment, better tax environment, certainly. And as a result, we saw the first real tangible acceleration in the light blue line, indicative of business cycle rise. But right at this inflection point that I'm pointing to right now, that is April. So what happened in April? That's the Liberation Day announcements. That's when tariffs really started to pick up momentum. And as you can see, that light blue line started to converge with the dark blue line. So it's no longer accelerating. It's now basically moving sideways. The reason why this is important is because the light blue line actually leads the dark blue line by about 3 to 5 months. And you can see here, anytime there are turns, the light blue line turns before the dark blue line does. So that's the lead lag relationship between the short-term growth rate and the long-term one. And so the fact that we are now seeing the faltering of that rising trend in the light blue line basically means that over the next 3 to 5 months, the most likely direction for the industrial or the B2B economy is sideways, not distinctly up or accelerating, not slowing or declining into recession, but basically treading water and moving along that tepid, close to 1% growth rate. So there's nothing overly scary out there in the near term, the next 2 quarters or so, but there's also nothing to really celebrate. I think that until we can get out of our own way with all of this policy volatility and uncertainty, this is the likeliest trajectory that the economy is going to follow, which is basically treading water, moving sideways, at least into the early part of 2026. Just like I showed you on the consumption side, we also see this bifurcation or the splitting into the K-shaped profile on the industrial side. And a great example of that has to do with the construction sector. So here we see that all other non-residential construction beside data centers is actually down more than $50 billion. But data centers are actually up over 15 billion, and really anything having to do with high tech, so semiconductor production, AI infrastructure, all of that is booming. But most traditional non-residential sectors, including commercial, office, education, leisure and hospitality, healthcare, all of those sectors are actually down below year-ago level. Again, illustrating this dynamic of winners and losers in an economy that is overall doing relatively well. So the hard data, as you can see, says that there are these two different directional trends. Some are positive, some are negative. Overall, we're kind of moving sideways. So what I've showed you so far is called hard data. These are monthly series reported by the government, and is this actually something that we can reliably track over time? There are also soft data metrics. So a soft data is usually referring to sentiment or the way that we feel, think, and talk about the economy. Here, I'm showing you an example of that in the Conference Board produces a CEO Confidence Optimism Index. This is measuring CEO confidence. And you can see we had this, once again, very nice trajectory of up to the right until about April, where it fell in response to Liberation Day. And even though it has bounced back a little bit, it's only come back to this yellow dotted line, which is right at 50, which means not contraction, not expansions, just basically sideways movement. So we now have both the hard data and the soft data, both the confidence indicators that can be consumer optimism, business optimism, as you can see in this case, CEO confidence in particular. They're basically saying movement to the side is the most likely outcome. And this is data that is very recent, as of 3Q of 2025. So now we're building this kind of body of evidence that says, without being able to see clearly into the future in terms of policy, these are the most likely kind of trajectories that we can expect for the next couple of quarters. But there's another way for us to look at the future and try to ascertain what the likely outcome is. Those are called leading economic indicators. And very simply put, a leading indicator is just a data series that consistently and accurately predicts what a different data series is going to do. So in this example, I've got a leading indicator in the light blue and a underlying data series that I'm trying to forecast or predict as the dark blue. You can see that the peak in the light blue there happens in the fourth quarter of 2009, and the peak in the dark blue series happens a year later in 4Q of 2010, which suggests that there is a 12-month lead time between the leading indicator and the underlying data series that we're trying to project. And looking at the data history, I can see this is consistently true. So this low predicted that low by about 12 months, this peak to that peak, this low to that low, that peak to that peak, and so on and so forth. So once I establish that lead lag relationship, I can then take the last 12 months of data in the leading indicator and actually physically push it forward by 12 months, aligning the lows and the highs and leveraging the last 12 months of data in the light blue line to say with a lot of confidence and certainty what the dark blue line is likely to do. And keep in mind that that blue line is not, the light blue line is not a forecast. It's not a guess. This is historic data. It's actually already happened. So let's take this example and see what are leading indicators telling us about the likely trajectory of the economy as we move forward. Well, the first one I'm looking at here is industry capacity utilization rate. I'm overlaying this over US Industrial Production Index, that measure of business to business activity that I think is more prevalent to your industry. And as you can see here, this has a 6-month lead time to the industrial economy. And over the next 6 months, what is it pointing to? Sideways movement, not specifically up, not down. We want to build more than one leading indicator into our analysis. And so another good example that I like to use is copper futures prices, because copper is so predominantly used in so many different elements of the economy, from electricity transmission and distribution, to machinery production, to electronics, to automotive, to construction activity. And here too, you can see it's quite volatile, but basically pointing to sideways movement over the next 9 months for the industrial economy. And the last, but my most favorite one, is the Purchasing Managers Index. This is the PMI. It has a 12-month lead time to industrial production, and it too, it's trying to break through, but this peak happened, by the way, on April, right after Liberation Day, so it kind of disrupted the previous rising trend. It started to rebound again, but as of right now, all I can point to is the next year or so, so into mid-2026 to the fall of 2026, the leading indicators are supporting the momentum indication from the hard and soft data that we're likely going to be kind of treading along that low single-digit positive growth rate for the industrial economy. And we're not going to be seeing that major like upward, but we're also not going to see that decline that most people fear in terms of recessionary behavior either. The last slide I have here on the specific macroeconomic data is the famous dot plot chart. This is the Fed's tool for indicating what they're planning on doing with interest rate policy. This is basically saying that we can expect 2 more rate cuts. In fact, I think there's one coming this week. It'll be a 25 basis point or 0.25% cut. And then we can expect another one in November or December timeframe, and then one more in early 2026. Now, the implication of this is that we're getting away from being restrictive with our interest rate policy, which means the Fed is actually actively trying to throttle down the economy to keep a lid on inflation, and we're moving more towards a neutral policy. I don't think this is going to be enough to really stimulate a lot of economic activity, because in order to be stimulative, we need to be below 3% average on the federal funds rate. And as you can see, where they're aiming longer term to be somewhere in the 3.25%, 3.5% range. And so that's not stimulative in my view. So it's not going to be enough in and of itself to really gear us up for that next leg upward in the economy. We need policy clarity in order to be able to do that. The last couple of comments I want to make are on the labor market, because most people tend to be pointing to the labor market right now as a potential harbinger of doom, with the fact that we have been adding a lot less jobs over the last several months. And while it's true that the number of job additions have fallen fairly dramatically, I don't think this is as major negative news as other people would lead you to believe. And let me explain to you why. First, let me go through the data here. As of the latest reported numbers that we have, which are for through the end of month of August, we added 22,000 jobs that month to the economy. The unemployment rate did tick up to 4.3%, and the average hourly earnings were actually still elevated at 3.7%. This last number, I think, is probably just as important as the others here, because it says that for your cost of living adjustments, for your COLA raises for your staff this year, you really need to be in that 3 to 4% range, because not only do you want to be competitive with what the rest of the country is doing, but with inflation being at 3%, anything lower than that will make your people feel like they're falling further behind financially, and it will only incentivize them to look for other jobs potentially. So, as you're planning for what to do near year end in terms of salary adjustments, really 3 to 4% is where you need to be competitive. Now, looking at the other two numbers in more detail, let's look at the job gains first. So when I said that we had much higher job gains, historically, you can see that in this particular chart. In fact, the 6 months before April all had 100,000 or more jobs added in the US economy. Now, April, remember, we keep coming back to that unfortunate April timeframe of the Liberation Day announcement. Well, after that happened, you can see the month of May was very weak. June has actually been revised down to negative, which means that we lost jobs in the US economy in the month of June for the first time in almost 5 years. Good news is that July was revised upward and was a kind of bounce back month. But once again, you can see how weak the August data was compared to what we were experiencing kind of in that late 2024, early 2025 timeframe. So this is truly an indication that the labor market is much weaker than it was a year ago, certainly. So not anywhere close to where we were in 22 or 23. But I also don't think that this means that we're heading for a recession, because to me, it's not the number of jobs that we add. It's more of a question of, do all the people that want jobs, are they still able to find employment, and therefore can they continue to spend money the way that they usually do? And by and large, the answer to that question is a resounding yes. So in this data, what I'm showing you are layoffs in the United States. You can see that in the run up to recessions, layoffs really start to peak. So this is 2008, 2009. Here is obviously the crazy situation that happened in 2020. By the way, if you want to understand the full impact of how severe 2020 was in terms of layoff activity, that blue line that you're seeing should actually be 5 times the height that's on this chart. It was cut off because it was so vast. But as I look at the latest data, what I'm seeing is that currently layoffs are tracking at basically late 2019 levels before the pandemic. So nothing that exhibits recessionary environment. And this is really an important point to make, because you should also understand that as you want to be prepared for when that next leg up in the economy comes, you've got to be focusing on retention. And when you do that, you have to recognize that looking at the overall unemployment rate just by itself in a vacuum is not very helpful. Not when you realize that good, experienced people management positions still face an unemployment rate of just 1.8%, that engineering and, for example, faces a 1.4% unemployment rate. The people that are doing installation, repair, and maintenance, just above 3%. So specific positions are still very, very difficult to fill. And as a result, what you really want to focus is on making sure that you retain the people that you have, and so that you can be, you know, energized out the gate when the economy really does take off, when the policy certainty evens out a little bit and there's not so much volatility around. And then one last message that I want to deliver to you is that while right now the focus is very much on stemming the flow of illegal immigrants and getting illegal immigrants out of the United States, I think not enough energy and effort is being placed on fixing the legal immigration. This data that I'm sharing with you right now comes from a really interesting report that I think everybody should read. It's called The Rising Storm, put out by a company called Lightcast. Again, I am just a fan. I don't have anything to do with those guys. It's about a 10 to 15 page document, but it's so compelling in its messaging. And this chart here really shows you kind of a hint of what the message is, which is without immigration, by the year 2027, we're actually starting to lose hundreds of thousands of workers from the US labor force every single year. So it's not in some distant future. It is imminent, and we really have to find ways for people to want to come into this country, for people with skills and for people without many skills too, because they are willing to take positions in agriculture, in construction, in frontline manufacturing, in leisure and hospitality, in some of these entry-level positions, retail environments, food service sales that Americans just don't want to do. We need people in those roles, and so we've got to fix the legal immigration issue, as well as address the illegal immigration issue as well. So having said all of that, I know that that is a lot to get through, so I appreciate you bearing with me for the last hour or so. I do want to leave some time for Q&A, but before we do that, let me kind of boil it down to you in a nice package that you can take back to your organizations, share with your colleagues, and discuss with your family and friends. From a strategic perspective, I think what we have to do is recognize that, we are moving through this period of uncertainty into a time where complexity is going to be the name of the game. And in order to survive and thrive in that environment, we cannot be driven by emotion, fear, or anxiety. We have to make decisions based on data. We have to make sure that we have a very clear and up-to-date understanding of our supply chain. And most importantly, here in the red, we've got to simulate and prepare action plans for a variety of different outcomes. So you've got to know, if scenario A happens, this is what I'm going to do. If scenario B occurs, these are the moves that I'm going to make. And if scenarios D, E, F, and so on occur, I know at least some semblance of what I'll be doing in that. You don't want to be scrambling to come up with a plan when events unfold. You want to be going into implementation of the plan that you prepared previously. That way you can be, first out of the gate and gain the first mover advantage. In terms of the actual specific actions that I want you to think about, all of them really focus on answering the question, in this, crazy, volatile environment, what are the things that I can control? And the things that you can control are still quite numerous. For example, you can control the amount of communication that you have up and down your supply chain. So if you're currently talking to your top suppliers once a quarter, make that a monthly conversation. If you're talking to your best customers once a month, make that bi-weekly or weekly. Pick up the phone, get on a FaceTime call, go meet them in person, and share information. Provide them a commentary about what you're seeing in the marketplace, what your rationale is, what you're thinking about as you plan for the future. And in return, ask them to share back with you what they're thinking and doing and hearing. This has the added benefit of building a moat around your relationship. You move from transactional to a value added partnership. And when and if the economy does turn south and they're looking to cut orders as a customer with you, they're going to be looking to cut it with one of your competitors and keep yours intact as long as possible. So that's still very much in your control. Another element in your control is, for example, protecting margins. So I still think that the best way that companies that I've seen deal with tariffs, if it affects you directly, is through separate line item surcharges instead of overall price increases. But in general, you have to recognize that the cost of doing business will continue to go up, while the pessimism that exists out there means that customers will increasingly push back on any potential price increases that you're going to want to make. So as a result, you've got to be looking to shop around. You've got to find cheaper ways of buying the inputs for your business that you are purchasing, whether that's your electricity provider and your electricity rates, or your shipping and logistics provider, or just the cost of some of the inputs that you buy. So if you haven't gone out to the marketplace and shopped around in the last 6 months or so, absolutely do that as you close out the year. Try to use other people's pessimism to your advantage and get some lower pricing that will offset some of the higher cost of business that you're feeling from tariffs and from the labor market and so on. Excuse me. Lastly, I mentioned retention is key. You have to be competitive when it comes to pay. You don't have to be the best paying employer in the industry, but you do have to know at least what competitive market rates are and make sure your people feel like they're getting compensated fairly. So with that, I'll just throw up this last slide. That QR code is my LinkedIn profile. Please feel free to connect with me. And with that, I will stop sharing and I'll be happy to take some questions if there are any.
Alex, I do have a question. This is Rusty Smith at Forenta.
Yeah, hi, Rusty. What's
Hello. Very well done. Thank you for the presentation. Very well. My question is, since we have competitors that are foreign competitors that ship products into the states that we compete with, I've tried my best to do a Google search and see what I'm really after is what their tariff rate was, let's say 1 year ago, compared to what it is now. And it seems like everything I get, all the information I get, speculation, it's more, there's so much more in there than I want, and some of it is speculative. And so is there a place to go any foreign country, any particular country, what their tariffs were coming into our country a year ago, what they are now on specific products, and the same thing for our products going out of the country. Is there a place to go for that?
Yeah, as far as one centralized place, I can't think of any. I have not come across anything like that. I would say instead of using Google, I would try to use one of the large language models, whether that's ChatGPT or Perplexity, and see if you get any better results there, because those models do tend to go out to a multitude of sources simultaneously and bring back data. Now, you will have to confirm that what it's telling you is accurate, but I think it's a better option than using a Google search. But I think an even better option than that is I follow several very dependable, very knowledgeable, people that deal with basically they're trade representatives. They work in the foreign trade space. One person that I think you could consider following online. Let me. This is on LinkedIn. I connect with them, and they put out updates on a regular basis, especially when things change, and they provide links to the specific government documents that outline what a specific tariff category is. They do it by HTS code. They're very detailed about it. So let me just pull up. There are two people in particular that I try to follow. One of them is his name is Pete Mento, I believe. Pete. Give me just one second. I'm looking through my network. Yes, Pete Mento. He is the director of global customs at DSV, which is a U.S. licensed broker, customs broker. And so it's those kind of subject matter experts that I think will be able to give you the much more reliable information that you can get at a minimum. And I'm sure that some of them charge for this service, but at a minimum, they can point you to the source data from which you can pull this. So Pete is a great point of starting. There's a few others, but I'm happy to follow up with you and tell you a couple of other names that I follow online that are really good at providing that kind of information. But that's where I would start, is customs brokers, the people that live and breathe this stuff every single day, because I know that they have very well documented sources that they rely on themselves. And so they'll be able to at least point you in the right direction.
All right. Thank you.
All right. My pleasure. Any other questions?
Yeah, hey, Alex, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
On your good to see you again, by the way. Thank you for sharing your information. On your CPI, can you tell us what you see a projection on the lagging of tariffs as they're starting to be implemented into CPI, and what you see that 3% being driven up to, or on the cost side, what we can all look at? Because I think right now we're in this dead zone right now where we haven't seen tariffs hit the consumer side yet, but it's starting to now really matriculate its way through the distributors, through the supply chain, and this is in all areas. And obviously in we deal with the apparel industry and textile industry. We're seeing it now. And then I have a second follow-up question after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is a really astute point that you bring up, Chris. Thank you for mentioning it. So typically, if you look at historic implementation of tariffs in the past, we're talking 9 to 18 months before the full effect of the tariff is working itself through the system. So I think we're in the very early innings. Think about it as like, if it's a baseball game, we're in inning 2 or 3 of this long game. And
Which
so
game of the World Series, though?
Good one. So I would say by mid to third quarter of 2026, we should have a much better feel for it. I do think it's hard to project to exact extent how much more the CPI will rise specifically from tariffs, because one of the forces that is counteracting on the increasing prices is demand destruction. As certain product categories raise in price, the drop off in demand actually causes, in some cases, companies to lower their prices. So there are multiple forces acting on this. That's why I said, 3 to 5% to me feels right as the range. I don't see tariffs being significant enough to push us north of 5% on inflation, probably not even north of 4% in the foreseeable future, meaning the next couple of quarters. But I would say probably in that 3.5 to 4.5% is where things will shake out about 6 to 9 months from now. That would be my guess. So it's incrementally higher, but it's not higher enough to where we have to have interest rate hikes once again. Okay. I hope that
Yeah.
that helps. What's your follow-up question?
The follow-up is in with that, in looking at those forces, we've had shrinkflation, right? Where products, goods, and services prices have gone up, ounces and packages have gone down. We are now seeing this in the textile space right now because of tariffs, specifically in China and in mid-level brands. And I wonder if we're going to see it in other industries where the goods and services are being made inferior, lower end products, less weight density to what they're doing in order to compensate for tariff pricing, in order to see that. Where else would we, are some major factors for us in the distributor, in the manufacturing space, could we be seeing that too?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer, the more straightforward answer to your question is yes, I do expect that to happen,
Mhm.
especially when you see the consumer, especially that graph that I showed you, the top 20% are really
Yeah.
the ones holding the market afloat. The middle class and the bottom 40% are just keeping up with inflation. And so as inflation tends to go up, they'll be looking to downshift in terms of their preferences, I believe. And so more of that is coming. I don't have a specific answer in terms of which product categories. I would say it's going to be fairly broad-based in terms of how it's applied. So, you know, but I would be very much looking for that to be a fairly consistent development across the product landscape.
Great. I appreciate your insights. Thank you.
My pleasure. Absolutely. I have a question here in the chat from Alexander from Germany. Thanks for being here, Alexander. Really appreciate it. He would like to know if what the exchange rate is between the US dollar and the euro next year. That's a really difficult question for me to answer. You know, as a forecaster, I don't tend to play in the foreign currency exchange forecasts. I do think that it's fairly remarkable to see how far and how quickly the dollar has fallen so far in 2025, where I think as of right now, we're down about 9% against a basket of foreign currencies. There has been a little bit of a trend kind of to recover on the part of the dollar. We certainly see people piling into gold as they continue to lose faith in the dollar as the reserve currency, which I think that is a much more longer term trend. So I would say without specifically pinpointing it for the next 12 months, I would say that the propensity for the dollar to continue to slowly lose value over time, whether that's against the euro or against some of the other well-established currencies like the British pound or the Japanese yen, I think that's likely to continue. The more our debt gets in the United States, and by the way, the last $1 trillion of debt, we just crossed the $38 trillion mark. That happened in the shortest period of time ever. Less than 2 months it took us to add $1 trillion to our debt. So those are the kind of forces that tend to be long-term devaluing to the dollar. And that's what I expect to happen. Perhaps not necessarily in the next 12 months, but over the long term, I do think that the dollar will continue to slowly lose value over time. So I hope that that's helpful. My pleasure. Well, I know we're past the top of the hour. I'm happy to continue answering questions, but I also want to be respectful of your time. So if you need to drop off, please feel free to do so. Again, thank you for being here. I'll make sure to send a copy of the slides to Lucy and she can distribute them to everybody who joined. If you have any follow-up questions for me, either through LinkedIn or you can contact me by email, always happy to engage with you one-on-one and talk about the specific things that you care about. But with that, I'll just say thank you once again, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, Alex. That was incredibly insightful as always. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, Lucy.
Thank you.